The nurse who thinks she went to medical school. That's what Dr. Hargrove had called her last week, his voice carrying across the unit with the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting public humiliation. Laura Bennett hadn't flinched. She'd simply continued writing orders in the chart, her hand steady as surgical steel, while 3 residents glanced sideways and pretended not to hear. He had no idea what those trembling hands had held. He had no idea what waited beneath the practiced invisibility she wore like a second set of scrubs. Laura arrived at Sacred Heart, Portland at 1945 hours, moving through the sliding glass doors with the same purposeful silence she'd maintained for 2 years. 24 months of night shifts. 730 days of keeping to herself. Of being the nurse who didn't speak at staff meetings, who never challenged orders, who seemed to dissolve into the fluorescent-lit corridors the moment her shift began. The emergency department smelled of antiseptic and something darker underneath, blood that hadn't quite come clean, desperation that clung to the walls like humidity. She breathed it in. Didn't let it show. Her locker was in the back corner of the nurse's station, tucked behind the supply cabinet where she could change without performing the social rituals the other nurses observed. The younger nurses, Chelsea, Monica, the ones with husbands and Netflix passwords, they changed in the main locker room. They talked about weekend plans and posted their children's soccer photos. Laura changed alone and didn't ask why she'd stopped being invited to those conversations. She knew exactly why. Some people carried an energy that made others uncomfortable. Some people smelled like violence even when they smelled like soap. She pulled on her scrubs, the fabric pale blue and generic, designed to make every nurse look the same. To make her look the same. Her badge clipped to her collar with a soft click, Laura Bennett, RN, Portland Memorial. Not the whole truth. Never the whole truth. Tucked inside her jacket lining, sewn with careful stitches she'd made herself during a deployment that ended in ways that still woke her at 3 in the morning, was a patch. Faded cloth. The skull and crossed rifles of the 2nd Marine Division. Ramadi 2006. She touched it through the fabric the way other people touched wedding rings, the way the chaplain touched his cross. The night shift briefing happened at 20:15 in the break room. Laura sat in the corner, coffee untouched in front of her, her eyes tracking the assignments on the whiteboard. 14 beds. 3 nurses. One of them would get the cardiac unit, where the monitoring was constant and the patients were unstable. One would take trauma. One would take recovery. Laura already knew. She always got the difficult cases. Not because she was the best nurse, they didn't acknowledge that. She got them because she accepted them without complaint. Dr. Hargrove appeared at 20:30, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum with the rhythm of a metronome, each step announcing his arrival to anyone paying attention. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of posture that came from old money and older family money, straight-backed and absolutely convinced of his own centrality to the universe. He'd been the attending physician at Sacred Heart for 15 years. Before that, some prestigious hospital in Seattle. Before that, a residency at Johns Hopkins. He mentioned these facts often, sometimes in the same conversation. His hands were smooth. He'd never worked as a resident the way newer doctors did, never pulled a 36-hour shift in the trauma bay. He'd had connections. Mentors. A father-in-law on the hospital board. These things mattered more than skill, and everyone knew it. Laura watched him distribute charts to the other nurses. His eyes moved across her face without stopping, the way someone's gaze passes over furniture. Not worthy of acknowledgement. Not worthy of assignment discussion. She'd already been handed her 6 beds, the sickest ones, the ones that required documentation and precision and an almost supernatural ability to predict decompensation before it happened. She didn't ask him why. She never asked. The medication supply room was empty at 20:50. Laura ran through the inventory like she'd been trained to do, back when being trained meant something, when precision meant survival. Her hands moved through the drug boxes with muscle memory that belonged to another life. Morphine. Fentanyl. Succinylcholine. Medication she'd administered in field hospitals where anesthesia was a luxury and pain was just information you had to process and move past. Her fingers trembled for exactly 2 seconds while organizing the surgical tray, the kind of tremor that came from 14 years of training her body to do impossible things under circumstances that would break most people. She caught herself. Stopped. Arranged everything back into hospital standard with the kind of deliberate slowness that was supposed to suggest she was just another careful nurse, just another woman in scrubs who'd never held a field tourniquet or called a helicopter in under 2 minutes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like electrical insects trapped in the ceiling. Laura had learned not to hear it. She'd learned not to hear a lot of things. Sirens. Alarms. The sound a human body made when it was shutting down faster than medicine could fix it. At 21:15, Dr. Hargrove made his rounds through the unit. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his own presence. Laura was updating a chart when she heard him speaking to 2 residents near the nurse's station. His voice wasn't loud. That was the skill of it. His voice was pitched just loud enough that everyone could hear, quiet enough that if she complained, he could claim she'd misunderstood, that the residents must have misheard, that she was being oversensitive. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. Some of these nurses come in with books and think they've earned a medical degree, he was saying, his tone conversational, almost warm. They memorize a protocol or 2 and suddenly they believe they understand pharmacology. They don't understand dosing. They don't understand contraindications. They understand how to follow orders and smile while they do it. The residents laughed. Small, uncertain laughs, the kind people made when they weren't sure if they were permitted to be amused. Laura continued writing without changing her breathing. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hand didn't pause. The trembling was entirely internal now, controlled, managed, the kind of tremor that belonged to her alone. She'd learned compartmentalization in the Marines. Everything that was explosive got stored in a particular place in her mind, sealed in a way that it couldn't detonate in public. You couldn't survive 14 years of combat medicine if you let your emotions bleed into your work. You couldn't save lives if you were busy being angry. So the anger went in a box. The humiliation went in a box. The recognition that a man like Hargrove would never understand what her hands had done went in the deepest box of all. The patient assignment sheet updated at 21:30. Room 304 was receiving a transfer from Portland General. Incoming, male, 74, Marine General, admitted 3 days ago for elevated creatinine and what the referring physician's notes described as a possible cardiac complications. Monitor closely. The name appeared on the chart and Laura's entire nervous system recognized it before her conscious mind caught up. General Marcus Webb. Commanding Officer, 2nd Marine Division, Ramadi. The man who'd stood in the desert sun with his hand on Tyler's shoulder, who'd pinned the Navy Achievement Medal on her son's chest, who'd written the letter that said Tyler was the kind of Marine that made you believe in the future of the service. That kind of future. The kind that still existed because certain people had been willing to bleed for it. Laura read the chart twice. The vitals were concerning: blood pressure elevated, heart rate irregular, oxygen saturation at 91% despite supplemental O2. The creatinine was climbing, which meant the kidneys were struggling. The ECG showed signs of left ventricular strain. The notes from the referring physician were vague in the way notes got vague when doctors were uncertain. When they were hoping someone else would catch what they'd missed. She would be his nurse. The assignment was already made, already confirmed. She would monitor his vitals every 2 hours. She would watch his oxygen saturation. She would be the first person to notice if something changed, which meant she would be the last person standing between General Webb and what happened when the body stopped cooperating with the wishes of the mind. Dr. Hargrove passed her station at 21:45, his shadow falling across her desk. Bennett, he said, acknowledging her name the way someone might acknowledge a piece of equipment that was functioning adequately. Room 304 is all yours. Don't overthink it. It's a straightforward admission. Chart every 4 hours. Call if anything changes. The implication was clear. This was a simple case. She shouldn't find complications where there weren't any. She shouldn't make problems more dramatic than necessary. She shouldn't. Understood, Laura said quietly, her voice pitched low and respectful, the voice of a nurse who knew her place. She stood and walked toward the cardiac wing, where room 304 waited, where a man who'd meant something to her son lay in a hospital bed that smelled like industrial bleach, and where the next 72 hours would contain decisions that no one would understand until it was far too late to change any of them. The night shift stretched ahead of her. 12 hours. 720 minutes. 43,200 seconds until she could return to being invisible. What she didn't know yet was that everything was about to change. The Marine General arrived in room 304 with 2 family members in tow, his wife of 34 years, grey hair pinned back with surgical precision, and their adult daughter, both of them moving with the careful steps of people entering a shrine. Laura watched from the hallway as they settled around his bed, the wife's hand finding his, the daughter adjusting the pillow behind his head with the tenderness of someone who'd already practiced saying goodbye. The general himself looked diminished by the hospital gown, but his eyes tracked each family member with the same alert focus that had once commanded a room full of Marines. Laura recognized that look. She'd seen it in mirrors. The wife glanced up and caught her watching, smiled with the kind of gratitude reserved for people who'd already saved your husband's life once. Laura nodded and turned away, her badge catching the fluorescent light like a small silver accusation. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the medication room 40 minutes later, his white coat unbuttoned and flapping like a cape as he moved through the drawers with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Laura was checking the general's orders against the pharmacy printout, the familiar ritual of verification that had become her shield against uncertainty. Hargrove set down a medication order with the deliberate slowness of someone making a point. Digoxin. High dose. For a patient whose current medications included a beta blocker that would compound the cardiac effect into something dangerous, something that would make his heart rhythm climb like a fighter jet into a stall. Laura read it twice. Once to make sure. Once to be certain she wasn't imagining it. She spoke quietly, her voice practiced in the art of professional deference. Sir, I've reviewed his chart. His current beta blocker regimen, the digoxin, will interact. His rhythm is already bordered on atrial flutter. This combination could push him into. Into what, Miss Bennett? Hargrove didn't turn around. He was organizing something in the drawer, moving items with aggressive precision. Into something that might require actual medical training to manage. The medication room smelled like antiseptic and the faint chemical sweetness of For Solutions. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Laura kept her voice level. Into a dangerous arrhythmia. Possibly ventricular fibrillation. His age, his current condition. His current condition is being managed by someone with a medical degree. Hargrove turned now, his smile precise as a scalpel. Let me guess. You learned this in one of those online nursing refresher courses? Or did you read it in a Facebook group for people who think they're smarter than they actually are? She didn't flinch. Didn't let the muscle in her jaw do anything but clench once, controlled. The physician's desk reference clearly states. The physician's desk reference clearly states you should be preparing medications, not questioning them. He moved past her, his shoulder deliberately close enough to make her step back. I'm going to administer this myself. You can watch and learn. The general's room had changed in the 2 minutes it took them to walk there. The wife had moved to the window. The daughter was reading something on her phone. The general's eyes moved to Hargrove with the recognition of someone greeting an old acquaintance, and then shifted to Laura with something like apology in them. Hargrove made a show of introducing himself to the family, his voice warm and paternal, the kind of voice that made people trust him. He explained the medication like he was describing sunshine, therapeutic, necessary, entirely within standard protocol. The wife nodded. The daughter looked up from her phone. Nobody asked questions. Nobody ever did, not when doctors explained things with that particular tone of voice. Hargrove prepared the medication with theatrical precision, his movements deliberate enough that everyone could watch. He was humming something classical. Hargrove took a breath and spoke directly to the general's daughter, his tone shifting into something almost confidential. You know, it's important in situations like this to have nurses who understand their role. There are some, unfortunately, who watch too much television and think they've become clinicians. He laughed, a soft, sympathetic sound designed to make everyone in the room feel like they were part of an inside joke. Miss Bennett here questioned this order. Can you imagine? She seems to believe she has medical training. He looked at Laura directly now, and his smile was the smile of a predator. The nurse who thinks she went to medical school. The wife's expression changed. Not dramatically, Laura was learning to read these small shifts, but noticeably. The gratitude disappeared. It was replaced by something like embarrassment, second-hand discomfort at witnessing a subordinate overreach her authority. The daughter's mouth tightened. The general's jaw clenched, and Laura saw his hands form fists beneath the hospital blanket, saw him recognize the humiliation without being able to stop it. That was the cruelest part. Everyone in the room could see it happening, could watch him be diminished, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Laura took one measured breath. Held it. Let it out through her nose like she'd learned in combat medic training, when staying calm wasn't a personality trait but a survival skill. She let one tear escape, just one, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, her hand moving with the same steady precision she'd used to stabilize a spine or apply a tourniquet. Her voice came out quiet, controlled, shaped like ice. Sir, I've seen what happens when that drug interacts with his condition. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, her spine absolutely straight, her footsteps even on the tile floor, and she didn't hear what Hargrove said next because she'd already left the room. His laughter followed her down the corridor anyway, a sound designed to carry, designed to make sure she understood that compliance wasn't in question. The choice had already been made. She was going to administer the medication whether she believed in it or not, whether the science supported it or not, whether the Marine General's body could handle it or not. That was the point. The point wasn't medicine. The point was obedience. The medication room was empty when she returned. Laura stood there for a moment with the digoxin in her hands, reading the label like it might have changed in the last 5 minutes, like the interaction warnings might have disappeared if she just looked hard enough. They hadn't. She opened the general's chart and found his current medication list, running her finger down the names: metoprolol, lisinopril, amiodarone. 3 drugs that each had their own complicated relationship with the digoxin in her hand, 3 drugs that would multiply its effect until his heart rhythm didn't just flutter but danced. Pain was information. That's what they'd taught her in Ramadi, when a wounded Marine's vitals told you things his voice couldn't. And this medication order was screaming information. But Hargrove had made it very clear what information mattered. She prepared the 4-push slowly, drawing the medication into the syringe with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was about to do. Her hands didn't shake. They never did anymore. That was one of the things that had changed in her, one of the things that Ramadi had burned away. Fear expressed itself in trembling hands. She'd learned to live without fear expressing itself in anything visible. She administered the medication at 18:47 hours, watching the liquid enter the fall line, watching the general's wife lean forward with concern that might have been love or might have been the guilt of someone who'd just watched her husband be publicly humiliated without defending him. The general's eyes found hers for just a moment, and she saw recognition there. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. The break room the next day smelled like stale coffee and the kind of profound loneliness that 3 other people could create by leaving. Laura set her lunch down on the table, a sandwich she'd made at home, an apple, a container of yogurt, and sat down. Jennifer was already there, sitting with a new graduate nurse Stephanie and Marcus from the night shift. All 3 of them had been friendly enough during her first weeks. Jennifer had shown her where the extra supplies were kept. Marcus had warned her about Hargrove's mood swings. Stephanie had asked about her experience with pediatric patients. They were acquaintances. Not friends, but the thing you had instead of friends when you worked nights and kept to yourself. Jennifer glanced up. Made eye contact for exactly 1 second. Then she grabbed her tray, gestured to Stephanie, and stood up. We're going to eat in the lounge instead." Their chairs scraped backward like an indictment, like a verdict being announced. Marcus was slower. He looked at Laura with something like apology before he followed them, and that was worse somehow than outright rejection. The pity was worse than the scorn. It suggested he understood what was happening and had decided it wasn't worth the cost. The break room hummed with the sound of the refrigerator compressor working overtime. Laura sat alone with her sandwich and the weight of knowing exactly how quickly a single moment could remake you. She wasn't surprised. She'd learned in the Marines that hierarchies existed for a reason, and challenging them in public came with a cost. The cost was exile. The cost was watching people you'd worked beside for months decide, simultaneously, that association was dangerous. By the end of shift change, the write-up was on the unit board for everyone to see. It was printed on official hospital letterhead, her name spelled out in full, Laura Bennett, RN, license number 28475159. The charge nurse, Patricia, had posted it with visible discomfort, not meeting anyone's eyes as she did it. The document was clinical in its precision, insubordination. Questioning of physician authority. Inappropriate display of emotion in front of patient family. Creating unnecessary anxiety in the medical environment. Each accusation was punctuated with the same authority Hargrove had used in the medication room, but this time it was permanent. This time it was documented. This time it was evidence that Laura had exceeded her scope, that she'd forgotten her place in the careful hierarchy that kept hospitals functioning. Staff stopped to read it as they passed. Laura watched them from the hallway, watched the recognition dawn on their faces, not shock, but confirmation. This was what happened when you questioned authority. This was what happened when you thought you knew better. She saw Stephanie lean in and whisper something to Jennifer, saw Jennifer's response, saw the word unstable form on Jennifer's lips. The hospital smelled like antiseptic, like latex, like the specific chemistry of human suffering being addressed with protocols and precision. It also smelled, today, like judgment. Laura took one measured breath. She approached the board and read the write-up one word at a time, and she felt something in her chest that wasn't despair and wasn't anger, something more complicated that had to do with the reality of being seen only as the person Hargrove had decided she was. A single tear escaped. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with the document, her hand steady as a surgeon's. Someone whispered attention seeker just loudly enough for her to hear it, the words designed to sting, to suggest that even her moment of emotion was calculated. She turned and found Dr. Hargrove watching her from down the corridor, his arms crossed, his smile small and satisfied. She walked toward him directly, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "Sir, I've seen what happens when that drug interacts with his condition." She waited 1 second for a response. None came. So she turned and walked away, and this time nobody laughed at her, which somehow made it worse. The silence that followed her down the hallway was the silence of a verdict being finalized, the silence of a woman who just told a predator exactly what she knew and had walked away with her spine straight anyway. What she didn't know yet was that the general's heart was already beginning to show signs of strain, the medication Hargrove had ordered doing exactly what she'd predicted it would do, and that 3 days would pass before he understood what she'd tried to prevent. At 0200, Laura smelled smoke before the alarm sounded. Not the acrid burn of a structure fire, not yet. This was the thin, hot scent that came before the raw, the kind of smell that had made her dive into a canal in Ramadi when every other Marine was still checking their gear. Her nervous system recognized it as a countdown. Her hands were already moving before the cardiac wing erupted. The fire alarm shrieked through the hallway. Code red. Evacuation protocol. The hospital transformed in seconds from the controlled rhythm of night shift into fractured chaos, nurses running, patients being rolled out in beds, emergency lights strobing red against the darkened corridor walls. Voices overlapped, panicked, issuing contradictory orders. Someone was screaming about room 310. Someone else was shouting for a wheelchair. Laura moved the opposite direction. She'd tied her jacket around her waist an hour ago, the one with the unit patch sewn into the lining, the one that no one at Sacred Heart would ever see. Her scrubs were dark blue, practical, invisible. Her badge hung at her hip. She moved through the smoke-filled wing with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly which rooms still needed checking, which patients were stable enough to self-evacuate, which ones couldn't move. The chaos meant nothing to her. Chaos was information. Chaos was what happened when civilians panicked instead of executing protocol. Room 301, empty. The patient had already been moved. Room 302, same. Room 303 had a post-op appendectomy sleeping through the alarm with sedatives. She'd check on him after. Room 304 was where the Marine General slept, the commanding officer of Tyler's unit, the man who'd pinned medals on her son's chest in a desert she'd fought to forget. She found him seizing. His body was rigid, back arched off the mattress, every muscle contracted simultaneously. But that wasn't what killed her with the knowledge of what was coming. It was his chest. With each seizure contraction, his ribcage caved inward, collapsing, and it wasn't expanding back out the way it should. The duskiness spreading across his face told her why. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the chest cavity from the cardiac event his body was having, pressure building with nowhere to go, collapsing his lung, crushing the blood vessels that fed his heart. For minutes. Maybe 5. Then cardiac arrest. The fire alarm continued its mechanical shriek. Smoke curled under the doorframe like searching fingers. "General," she said, calm as if she were checking his vitals during a routine midnight round. "Look at me. You're okay. You're going to be okay." His eyes found her through the seizure, terrified, aware on some level that his body was betraying him. The seizure activity was slowing, the air pressure inside his chest was rising, crushing his nervous system. She'd seen this before. She'd seen this 43 times in a forward operating base near Ramadi when IED blasts peppered Marines with shrapnel that didn't always pierce skin but created cavitation damage that bled internally, that trapped air where air didn't belong. She moved to the supply cart without breaking stride. Her hands found the needle, a 14-gauge angiocatheter, the kind designed for rapid vascular access. It was not designed for what she was about to do with it. It was also the only thing that would save his life. "Dr. Hargrove. Evacuate that patient now. I'm giving you a direct order." His voice came from the hallway, sharp and panicked and utterly useless. She ignored him the way she'd ignored incoming fire, as background noise from someone with no authority over the next 60 seconds. Laura's fingers found the anatomical landmarks on the general's chest with the muscle memory that 20 years hadn't erased. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Just below the clavicle. The exact spot. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook, not when there was work to do. She swabbed with an alcohol pad she'd pulled from the cart in the same motion. The smell of antiseptic cut through the smoke. She angled the needle perpendicular to the chest wall, found the space between the ribs, and pushed through. The hiss of escaping air was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in 3 years. It came out like a compressed breath, like the pneumatic release of a pressure seal that had been climbing toward critical. The general's seizing stopped immediately. His body went slack. His chest rose on its own, that first desperate gasp of air moving back into collapsed lung tissue, oxygen reaching his starved heart, the duskiness fading from his face like a lamp being turned up incrementally. His eyes cleared. Sinus rhythm, she knew without checking the monitor, knew from the way color flooded back to his face, knew from the way his pupils dilated and focused. The door burst open. Dr. Hargrove stood in the threshold, surgical mask around his neck, his face a study in disbelief transitioning into something far more dangerous. "What the hell do you think you're?" he started. "Second intercostal space needle decompression," she said. Her voice was flat. She was already scanning his vitals, already calculating what came next. Tension pneumothorax from cardiac event. He was seizing. He was dying. You assaulted a patient. You performed a procedure without authorization. His voice climbed, his face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists. "Security. I want security in this room right now." The general's hand found Laura's wrist. His grip was weak but conscious. His voice came out hoarse from the seizure. "That nurse just saved my life." "You ever heard of a needle decompression, doctor?" Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. The hand on his radio trembled. Emergency responders appeared in the doorway behind him, firefighters in full turnout gear, already moving to assist with evacuation protocols. The fire chief, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, assessed the scene in 3 seconds. The general stabilized, breathing, conscious, vitals improving. She looked at Laura. Laura met her gaze and gave one small nod. "We need to move him to a safe area," the fire chief said. "Is he stable for transport?" "Stable," Laura confirmed. Chest rise is symmetric. Breath sounds are returning. BP stabilizing. He needs ICU for observation but he's not in immediate crisis. She guided the general through the evacuation process with the same calm efficiency she'd used in a surgical tent in a country she'd promised herself she'd never speak of again. The wheelchair. The hallway. The coordination with emergency personnel who treated her like someone who belonged, someone who knew the difference between panic and procedure. By the time the all-clear sounded an hour later, the general was in the ICU, chest imaging ordered, his rhythm stable on monitors, his breathing easy. The fire had been contained to a maintenance closet on the east wing. No structural damage. No casualties. The hospital would reopen by morning. But that wasn't the worst part. By morning, the general was stable in the ICU, breathing on his own, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm Laura had fought to restore. The hospital had contained the fire, cordoned off the damage, already planning the cleanup. But at 7:15 a.m., a security guard appeared at her locker with orders to report to the administrator's office immediately. Laura clipped her badge to her scrubs, the last time she would ever do this, and followed the uniformed man down the corridor without speaking. The administrator's office occupied the north corner of the 3rd floor, all glass walls and mahogany furniture that whispered money and institutional authority. Dr. Hargrove stood by the window with the light behind him, his silhouette sharp and certain, already smiling before she entered. That smile told her everything. He'd moved fast. He'd moved like a man who understood exactly how to weaponize bureaucracy, how to turn fear into liability, how to transform heroism into insubordination. Beside Hargrove sat 2 people Laura didn't recognize. One was a woman in a grey suit, the hospital attorney, Ms. Rodriguez, whose business card read Risk Management. Next to her sat an older man with a leather portfolio labeled Investigator Wilkins, Sacred Heart Credentialing Review. Laura sat down without being invited. Her hands rested flat on the table. Her spine straight. Her breathing steady. 16 years of training didn't break because one room held hostile faces. Ms. Rodriguez opened a manila folder and began reading aloud, her voice the precise instrument of someone who'd terminated dozens of careers. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Violation of scope of practice for registered nurses. Creation of liability exposure. Performing medical interventions beyond your credential level. Failure to contact on-call physicians before administering emergency treatment. Each sentence was a hammer swing, and they came one after another with mechanical precision. Hargrove leaned forward slightly. You understand that what you did in room 304 was outside your authority. You understood that. The medication order you questioned was a physician's decision. Your decision to perform a needle decompression, he paused for effect, letting the word sit like a legal threat, that a procedure only physicians and advanced practice providers are certified to perform. You could have killed him. You could have collapsed his remaining lung. You could have severed an artery. Laura said nothing. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. I've personally contacted everyone on your reference list, Hargrove continued, and now his voice carried the tone of a man delivering the final blow. Your previous supervisors. Your colleagues from before Sacred Heart. Every single one reported inconsistencies. Gaps in your employment history. Some of them expressed concerns about your emotional stability. One mentioned you seemed to disappear without explanation and reappear months later as if nothing had happened. He was lying. Laura knew he was lying. But the lie had been crafted carefully, planted in the minds of people who'd known her years ago, people she'd deliberately created distance from. He'd called them. He'd suggested things. He'd let their imaginations fill in the blanks. Investigator Wilkins slid a document across the table. Your credentials show a gap between 2007 and 2009. No employment listed. No explanation in your file. We reached out to the organizations you listed as references, and they could barely remember you. When we asked about the circumstances of your departure, several became evasive. He was reading from a prepared narrative that Hargrove had written. Laura could see the fingerprints of the sabotage all over it. Hargrove had known exactly what to say to make people nervous. He'd known exactly how to weaponize silence, to turn anonymity into suspicion, to make healing look like instability. There are also discrepancies in your nursing license application, Wilkins continued. Dates that don't align, credential verifications that took longer than standard. The state board has been notified. There will be an inquiry. That may result in suspension pending review. Laura's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough that she felt it, but not enough that anyone else would notice. 2 years of careful work. 2 years of night shifts and quiet competence and deliberate invisibility. All of it dismantled in 72 hours because she'd used her hands the way they were trained to be used. We've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately, Ms. Rodriguez said, sliding a second document toward her. You'll sign this severance agreement acknowledging receipt of final paycheck minus the cost of the unauthorized procedure and associated investigation. You'll surrender your badge and credentials. You will not return to Sacred Heart facilities without express written permission from our legal department. If you do, we will file charges. The security guard shifted his weight slightly. His hand rested near his belt, a gesture so small it barely registered, but it said everything. He was here to make sure she left, and left quietly. Laura picked up the severance agreement and read the numbers. $1,200. Deducted from her final paycheck. She signed it with a ballpoint pen someone had left on the table. Her signature was steady. Her hands didn't shake. You'll understand why we have to take this seriously, Hargrove said, his voice now softer, more reasonable, the tone of a man who'd already won. You put a patient at risk. You violated established protocols. You created a liability we can't ignore. If something had gone wrong, if that needle decompression had caused a hemorrhage, well, we'd be looking at a lawsuit that would have bankrupted half our departments. We have to protect the hospital. We have to protect patients. He was speaking to the investigator now, not to Laura. He was performing reasonableness for a third party, and it was brilliant. Because when it looked back, when someone reviewed this termination, it would read like due diligence. It would read like institutional responsibility. No one would ask why every reference had suddenly reported psychological concerns. No one would question the timing of the credential gaps. No one would notice that Hargrove had spent 48 hours systematically dismantling her record. Laura stood. The security guard stood with her. You can leave your badge at the front desk, Ms. Rodriguez said. There will be a final check mailed to your address of record. Do you have any questions? Laura looked at each of them in turn. Hargrove. Rodriguez. Wilkins. The security guard. For people who believed what they were looking at, or at least believed they had plausible deniability for believing it. No questions, she said quietly. The walkout took 7 minutes. Down the third-floor corridor. Past the unit where she'd worked 2 years of 12-hour nights. Past the break room where nurses she'd respected had stood up and left the moment she sat down. Past the unit board where her write-up had been displayed like a public scarlet letter. The security guard escorted her to the main lobby where the morning shift change was happening, where residents and attendings and nurses and housekeeping staff were all transitioning from night to day, and she walked through the middle of them with a banker's box holding her belongings, her uniform, the small collection of items that represented her professional existence. The September rain had started again in Portland, the kind that falls sideways and soaks everything. She sat in her car for 10 minutes with the box in a passenger seat and her uniform still in a locker upstairs. Then she drove south towards Seattle. The VA hospital occupied for city blocks and served 2,000 veterans at any given time. The waiting room for intake appointments on that Tuesday evening smelled like old coffee and the kind of industrial antiseptic that hospitals use when they've given up on making places feel like healing happens. Laura sat with a clipboard of intake forms and watched the people around her. A woman with a prosthetic leg reading a magazine. A man with deep scarring across his forearms. 3 veterans in wheelchairs. Another woman with the 1,000-yard stare that Laura recognized immediately because she wore it too, the expression of someone whose nervous system had learned to anticipate threat before it manifested. She knew most of these people. Not by name. Not as people. But their wounds had passed through her hands. She'd applied tourniquets to their legs. She'd held airways open for them. She'd run compressions on their chests and watched them come back from the edge. She'd stitched them up and sent them forward and then gone back to the perimeter for the next casualty and the next and the next, 3 days of non-stop triage until the siege lifted and the medevac helicopters finally came. The intake paperwork asked about suicidal ideation, about sleep patterns, about substance use, about triggers for anxiety and hypervigilance. Laura filled out every question with the precision that had defined her career. She didn't minimize. She didn't exaggerate. She simply documented the facts: 2 years of unmanaged PTSD. Recurring nightmares. Hypervigilance in clinical settings. Self-isolation. Avoidance of situations that might expose her identity. Professional trauma from forced exposure. A woman in scrubs called her name, and Laura followed her back to a small office where a therapist with kind eyes and a nameplate reading Dr. Patricia Okafor, Ph.D. gestured to a comfortable chair. "Tell me what brought you in tonight," Dr. Okafor said gently. Laura pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining. It was smaller than she remembered, the 2nd Marine Division insignia just barely visible through years of careful wear. She'd sewn it inside her jacket when she became a nurse, hidden against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like a secret that might explain why her hands never quite felt like they belonged to a civilian world. "I got fired today," Laura said quietly. "Because I used what these hands know how to do. And I'm trying to remember why I thought anonymity would be enough to fix what remedy broke." Dr. Okafor leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about remedy." Outside the VA hospital, the Seattle rain continued its assault against the windows. Inside the waiting room, a veteran with the same unit patch on his chest waited for his appointment, and he didn't recognize the woman who'd saved his life, and that was exactly how Laura had arranged it. She'd spent 24 months constructing a wall between who she had been and who she was trying to become, and in 3 days, a man with an ego and a network had demolished it completely. The question she couldn't answer, sitting in Dr. Okafor's office with her hidden patch now visible in her hands, was whether that demolition was destruction or liberation. Whether being forced back into the light was punishment or rescue. She was broken enough now to ask for help. She was desperate enough to stop running. The intake papers blurred as she filled them out, and for the first time in 2 years, Laura Bennett let herself cry. The general was the one who made the first call. He was still bandaged across the chest, still moving like his ribs remembered what it felt like to collapse inward, but his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 40 years giving orders in places where orders meant life or death. He'd called the base commander at Joint Base Lewis McCord. He'd called the Medical Inspector General's office. He'd called the Navy's Judge Advocate General. By the time Laura's phone buzzed with a notification that her termination paperwork had been flagged for review, FBI Special Agents Morrison and Keyes were already pulling into Sacred Heart's parking lot, their unmarked sedan cutting through the rain like a blade. They'd started with the personnel files. What they found made Morrison's jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee in his hand. Hargrove's notes weren't sloppy, they were calculated. Disciplinary records backdated to justify the termination. Performance reviews fabricated to paint Laura as unstable. An entire investigation report he'd invented, signed by an investigator named Wilkins who'd never actually examined anything. The reference checks he'd sent to Laura's listed contacts bore timestamps but no actual responses. He'd intercepted them, created his own negative replies, forged the verifications. Keyes held up a document with trembling hands that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with professional rage. He built an entire case out of air, she said. Every page in this file is a federal crime. Agent Morrison walked into Hargrove's office at 1:27 p.m. Dr. Hargrove looked up from his desk, confusion flickering across his face like he couldn't immediately process why federal law enforcement was standing in his doorway. Morrison had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Tall enough to move through doorways without tilting his head. Eyes that had seen enough institutional corruption to recognize its exact shape on faces. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Morrison said, not a question. We need you to come with us. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. His hand moved toward his phone. Keyes stepped forward. That's not happening, Doctor. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with the same finality as a code blue monitor flatline. They read his rights in the hallway where 3 nurses heard every word. Falsification of medical records. Fraud. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to damage a government witness. Morrison's voice was flat and procedural, not angry, which somehow made it worse. Anger could burn itself out. This was institutional certainty. This was the sound of someone who'd done this exact choreography 200 times before. Hargrove's face had gone the color of institutional walls, all the blood retreated inward, leaving only the structure underneath. They walked him past the unit board where Laura's write-up still hung. Every nurse in the cardiac wing stopped moving. No one breathed. The fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in glass, and Hargrove's Italian shoes, the expensive kind he wore to emphasize the distance between himself and everyone else, scraped against linoleum with a sound like bone on concrete. The board members he'd called found themselves facing the same federal agents. Dr. Chen received a phone call asking about his involvement. Ms. Rodriguez, the board member who'd approved the immediate termination, discovered that the FBI considered her decisions material facts in an obstruction investigation. The lawyer Sacred Heart kept on retainer started making calls, but by then the investigation had already moved beyond the hospital's walls. Wilkins, the fake investigator, got an early morning visit at his consulting office. The paperwork Hargrove had forged bore signatures that existed in no official record. The timestamps didn't match any hospital system logs. Every thread Morrison and Keyes pulled led to another fabrication, another document altered, another expert witness who'd never been contacted contradicting evidence that bore his name. That afternoon, Laura was called back to Sacred Heart. She was still wearing the clothes from the VA waiting room, the same scrubs she'd been wearing when security escorted her out 3 days ago. The administrator met her in the main conference room, his expression the careful construction of someone who'd learned in the previous 4 hours that he'd made catastrophic mistakes. Miss Bennett, he began, and the formality of it, her last name, the title, the acknowledgement that she was a person with a name and not just a problem to be erased, made something in her chest shift. The administrator spoke about immediate reinstatement. About the damages the hospital would pay. About lawyers and settlements and criminal referrals being made to the state medical board. None of it mattered. What mattered was that the general appeared in the doorway at that exact moment, pushing himself forward in a wheelchair, his hospital gown visible beneath a bathrobe, his chest still wrapped in bandages because he'd checked himself out of his own room to come here. He looked at Laura directly. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the texture of command underneath, the kind of quiet that comes from having given orders that sent people into fire. "That's what you got for the Jolin district siege. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for shrapnel wounds sustained under direct fire. 1 for a compound fracture your medic hands reset in the field because there was no time for a hospital and you couldn't let the squad medic stop working." He paused. His breath sounded deliberate, the sound of someone whose lungs still remembered what it felt like to nearly stop working. Combat Action Ribbon. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a 3-day operation where you saved 43 Marines. 43. Under direct fire. Multiple casualties. No backup. He looked at Hargrove, then back at Laura. You never told anyone, did you? Not even your commanding officers expected to find you teaching civilian CPR under a different name. Laura's hands were steady. The unit patch that had lived hidden inside her jacket lining all those months was finally visible on her shoulder now, the 2nd Marine Division insignia, Ramadi 2006, the patch that had defined the worst 3 days of her life and the best version of herself she'd ever been. She'd worn it under layers because seeing it every day had felt like pressing on a wound that wouldn't close. Now she stood with it uncovered, and the air in the room seemed to shift around her. The hospital is reinstating you, effective immediately, the administrator said, his voice the texture of someone reading prepared words and meaning none of them. We're establishing a trauma center under your direction. We're naming it. He paused. The administration recommends. He stopped again. The general spoke instead. We're naming it the Bennett Trauma Center. And I'd like you to head the program. It wasn't a request. The Marine general didn't make requests. He made commands. His voice had that quality, the kind that moved through air like something with weight, something that bent everything around it into compliance. Laura looked at him. Looked at the bandages under his hospital gown. Looked at the wheelchair and the visible tremor in his hands, tremor not from age but from the knowledge that she'd run a needle through his ribs and saved his life and then been destroyed for the competence required to do that. She'd been taught never to speak above her rank, never to question authority, never to make herself visible. 3 days at the VA waiting room had taught her something different. She opened her mouth. I'll need to rebuild everything, she said. Her voice wasn't deferential anymore. The protocols are outdated. The equipment is inadequate. The staff is trained wrong. The general smiled. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of smile that comes from watching someone finally stop hiding. Good. Build it right. 6 months later, someone sent Laura a photograph in an unmarked envelope. It showed Dr. Marcus Hargrove in a Portland Community College classroom, standing in front of bored teenagers, teaching basic CPR for $18 an hour. His medical license was revoked, his freedom conditioned on his guilty plea to multiple federal felonies, his career the kind of cautionary tale that whispered through hospital corridors now. Laura placed the photograph in her desk drawer at Sacred Heart, in her office, the office that had been Dr. Hargrove's office once, the same position he'd held and wielded like a blade. She placed it beneath her new ID badge. The badge read, Laura Bennett, Director of Emergency Medicine, Sacred Heart, Portland. Beneath that, she placed the jacket with the unit patch. The jacket that no longer needed to hide. The cardiac wing where she'd been humiliated and fired and isolated was now the Bennett Trauma Center. Tyler visited every weekend, finally understanding why his mother had disappeared 2 years ago, why she'd needed anonymity and silence and the kind of invisibility that only a night shift could provide. He saw the service record on the wall of her office now, the photos from Ramadi, Laura with blood on her hands, doing the work that had broken her and also made her unbreakable. The general attended the dedication ceremony. He was walking without the wheelchair by then, his chest still tight but breathing, his voice still carrying that weight of command. He pinned her Navy Cross to a display case in the main lobby. For medals gleamed under the lights, the Bronze Star, the Combat Action Ribbon, the 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy Cross that meant she'd done something in combat that the military hierarchy had decided was extraordinary. He looked at her in front of the assembled nursing staff and doctors and board members. I almost died 3 days after she saved my life, he said, because someone decided that competence in a woman was more threatening than incompetence in a man. That ends here. The night shift nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room now worked under her leadership. Laura taught them the trauma protocols she'd developed under fire in Ramadi. She taught them how to function when backup wasn't coming. How to make decisions when there was no time for committees. How to trust their hands when their minds were drowning in fear. The investigator Wilkins lost his consulting license. The board members who'd enabled Hargrove faced their own reckoning, their careers quietly sidelined, their recommendations questioned, their integrity permanently compromised. The hospital's lawyer made sure none of it touched Sacred Heart's reputation directly, but the message was clear: competence demanded recognition now. Silencing people for knowing too much was no longer going to be tolerated. Laura stood in her office at 0200, the same hour she used to make rounds in silence. She touched the unit patch one final time before framing it on her office wall where everyone could see. The patch that had lived in darkness was now visible to anyone who walked into her office. She'd spent 2 years hiding from her past, letting Ramadi and its violence live in shadows and private moments. Now she was teaching it. She was naming it. She was standing in front of young nurses and saying, "This is what I did. This is who I am. And this is the standard we're going to maintain." She stood in the tactical command center of the new trauma unit, the equipment gleaming, the protocols streamlined, the staff trained to the level of combat medical teams. Her voice cut through the air like something with authority underneath it. No more deference. No more lowered eyes. No more hiding. The trembling wasn't in her hands anymore. It never had been. It had been restraint. The ability to hold power in reserve, to wait for the moment when unleashing it would matter. That moment had come. That moment was now. If you've ever had a boss who didn't see your real strength, who built his power on your silence, subscribe and hit the notification bell to watch justice catch up with people like that every single time. Like this video if you believe competence should matter more than comfort. Comment, what would you have said in Laura's office on day one as the new director? And most importantly, share this with someone who needed to know that hiding isn't the same as surviving. Sometimes it takes someone standing in the light to show the rest of us how to stop being afraid.